Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Turn you up a little bit here. Okay, so you're the opening talk. I'm going to let you kind of take it away here.
All right.
Let me stop my share.
All right.
And then you can share screen and we'll be good to go.
Right. I should be sharing my screen right now.
Yep, you're good.
All right. So let's get going. So hi, everyone. Hope you are having a good day today, or you are going to have a good day today if it's morning where you are now. Big talks, long talks, covering everything about the framework. And I'm going to start by diving the Q component of Laravel. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Mohamed Said, and I'm a full stack developer at Laravel. I love free diving, cycling, swimming, and running, and I love Laravel queues. And I'm not sure about you, but I think it's the most interesting component in the framework. I know most people, when they think about the queues, they think about this complicated piece or complicated corner in the framework that just works. And it's hard to understand how it works. It just works. So hopefully by the end of this talk, I will be able to show you how the queue component works and how you can use it in your application. Of course, covering everything about queues is impossible in just 60 minutes, but I will do my best to show you the most important stuff and also show you how you can dive on your own and see everything about how the queue system works. So without further ado, let's start. This screenshot is from forge.laravel.com. It's a service that allows you to provision servers for running PHP and Laravel applications. This service, it uses queues a lot. It's queue intensive application. Part of what it does is that it allows you to deploy your website using a simple button. So you can see the deploy now green button in front of you. And when the user clicks this button, a deployment starts. Deployment normally takes from a few seconds up to 10 minutes, depends on what the deployment script is like. And you don't want your users to have to wait until the entire deployment is finished before they receive a response from the browser after they click on the deploy now button. So we have two ways of achieving the deployment, either doing it synchronously, which is we'll have the user wait until the deployment script runs, and then the browser will respond to his click and tell him that the deployment is done. Or asynchronously, which is using Laravel queues, and this is done by when we receive the request from the user that they want to deploy, we're going to send the deployment work to the background and reply to the user or respond to the user immediately, telling them that, yes, we received your deployment request. We're going to work on it and let you know when we are done. And during this time, between clicking the button and the actual deployment finishes, the user is free to use the application to do any other tasks they want. So what helps us achieve the asynchronous execution of work in Laravel is the Laravel queue system. And I am going to show you or give you a simple explanation of how it works. First, when you dispatch a job to the queue, when you have like a deploy side job in our example, Laravel is going to take this job instance and convert it to a string form, and then send this string form to a storage system. A storage system could be a database, could be a Redis instance, could be a third-party library like Amazon SQS. After it's sent in the storage, you start a worker, and the job of this worker is to query the queue store continuously, asking for tasks. And whenever it finds a task in the store, it converts it back from the string form to the object form and then executes it at the end. The first part is called enqueuing or dispatching, and the second part is called dequeuing or processing. So this is an example job. It's a deploy site job from our example, and this job accepts a site instance in the constructor, and inside the handle method, we call the deploy method on this site instance. So when you dispatch the job like this, you call the dispatch static helper and you pass any constructor arguments the job is expecting to the dispatch helper. And when you do that, Laravel is going to convert the job, the object, to this string form. This is a typical payload of a Laravel job stored in the queue. And this part here, the highlighted part, it's a serialized version of your deploy side job. You can see here that all the data about the instance is stored here. So when the worker picks it up, again, it can convert it back to an instance to execute it. And this serialization is done using the serialize method provided by PHP. So again, this is how the payload looks like when stored in the system, in the storage system for the queue. And Laravel is going to take this payload and send it to the queue. This is the queue. Like this is a basic example of the queue. It's just several jobs, one after the other, put in the queue. And if we are using the database queue driver, for example, for simplicity, this is going to be to look like this. It's just a simple database table that has all the jobs that are pushed to the queue. Each job has the payload stored, the number of attempts, the time the job should be available, and so on. And the jobs are stored by the oldest first, because in the queue, the oldest jobs are always executed before the newest jobs that are pushed to the queue. And in Laravel, there is not only the database queue store or the database queue driver, there is also the beanstalk driver, the SQS driver, and the Redis driver. And inside the queue.php configuration file, you can configure multiple connections. In the example, in this talk, we are going to use the database connection, for example, but you can use any of these connections in your application. So here is the queue with several jobs waiting to be processed. To start processing jobs, you start a worker. And this worker is going to look at the end of the queue or at the oldest job and pick this job to process it. When it's done, it's going to look at the end of the queue and get the second oldest job, and so on, keeps picking jobs until the queue is completely empty. And if the queue is full of jobs, it's not processing fast enough, you can start more than one worker to process jobs. Each of these workers is going to look at the oldest job in the queue and process it. While worker number one is processing the oldest job, worker number two could be processing the second oldest job. So the more workers you start, the faster the jobs in the queue are going to be processed. When a worker picks a job, it's going to take the string of the job and convert it back to the object instance, and then execute the handle method on the job, which does the work for you. And that's basically how the queue works. To sum this up, dispatching a job converts it to a string form, stores it in the queue storage driver that you choose for your application, and then you start a worker. This worker is going to get the jobs from the queue store, resolve them into an instance, and execute the handle method on that job. Now, that's the simple explanation of how the queue system works. Now, let's go into a deeper dive to see how things work behind the scenes, starting with how dispatching works. There are several types of dispatching inside Laravel. Dispatching single jobs, a chain of jobs, or patches of jobs. A single job is a job that is, when it's done, there is nothing else to do. It's just a single unit of work. A chain of jobs is several jobs that are put in a chain and they are executed one after the other. The second job in the chain will not get executed until the first job is completely done and successful. And batches of jobs, a batch is also a group of jobs, but they can be executed in parallel. So chains and batches, you push several jobs at the same time, but in chains, they are executed one after the other, and in batches, they can be executed in parallel. We'll start by exploring how dispatching single jobs work. Again, to dispatch a job to the queue, you can use a dispatch static helper. But also you can define the connection that you want to dispatch the job to, as well as the queue, as well as a delay that you can set. Here are the connection that we set is the database connection. So Laravel is going to create an instance of the database connection and use it to send this job to the database store. So here's an example of how the code looks like. So we have our job, and Laravel is going to create an instance of the database queue, store it in a queue variable here, and depends on whether or not you are setting a delay for the job, it's going to call the right method. If you are not setting a delay, it's going to call the push on method, which pushes the job to the deployments queue in the store. If you are setting a delay, it's going to call the later on method, which pushes the job to the queue, but pushes it with a delay. So it will not get executed or picked by a worker before the delay period passes. There are several features that Laravel offers for jobs of different kinds. We're going to look at some of those features, and I will try to explain to you how this works behind the scenes, starting with payload encryption. First, we have this deploy site example job, and to say that we want the payload of this job to be encrypted, we can either implement the should be encrypted contract on the job, or declare a public property called should be encrypted and set it to true. When you do that, Laravel is going to understand that you want to encrypt the payload of the job, particularly this part. If you look at this payload, you can see the deploy site, the serialized version of the deploy site job here, and all the public methods on this instance are visible to the human eye. So if you store any sensitive information or you pass any sensitive information to the job constructor method and send it to the queue, if anyone gains access to the queue store for any number of reasons, they will be able to read this sensitive information and extract it from the payload. So Laravel allows you to encrypt this part of the payload, so only the Laravel application running can encrypt and decrypt this payload. And if someone gains access to the queue store, they won't be able to see the sensitive information that you store. And the way Laravel does that is that it takes the serialized version of the job and creates an instance of the encryptor, which is a component in the Laravel framework as well. And it uses the encryptor to encrypt this string, the serialized version of your job, encrypt it and store it in the payload under the command attribute of the data attribute of the payload. Another feature that the framework offers is allows you to wait for database transactions to commit before you can dispatch jobs to the queue. And if you are not familiar with how database transactions work, or why they are useful, you start a database transaction and you can execute multiple database queries, insert, update, and delete queries, and they either all succeed or all fail. So if you start a database transaction and you send several queries and an exception happened in the middle, the entire transaction will be rolled back and won't take an effect or won't have an effect on your database. But if everything went smooth, you commit the transaction, so all the queries will be executed and the database will be affected. A problem happens when you dispatch a job while a database transaction is open. When this happens, the job will be dispatched to the queue before the database transaction commits. And if a worker picks the job right away and starts processing it, the job will not have access to the records created or updated inside the database transaction because the transaction hasn't committed yet. So by the time you start, or by the time the worker picks the job and tries to execute it, it's going to find the database in a state that it is not usable. So to help you fix that, Laravel supports delaying dispatching jobs to the queue after database transactions commit. So if you call the after commit method after dispatching a job, Laravel will understand that you want this job to only be dispatched after any database transactions that are currently open are committed. And the way it does that is that it stands there, and when you dispatch any job, it's going to check if there are any open database transactions. If so, it's going to store the jobs inside a local array. Instead of sending it to the queue, it's going to store it inside a local array and waits until the database transaction commits. Once it commits, it checks the local array, which is pending jobs here in our example, and loops over it and pushes all the jobs that are stored in this local array. So they are pushed to the queue and a worker will be able to process them. One final feature that we are going to look at here in the dispatching part is job uniqueness. And to implement job uniqueness, all you need to do is to implement the should be unique interface on your job instance. And what it does, what Laravel does is that it's when you dispatch a job, it will try to acquire a lock on this job using the cache facade or the cache component of Laravel. If it was able to acquire the lock, that means that there is no other job that was able to acquire the same lock. The lock is free to acquire. When it acquires it, it will push the job to the queue. However, if there is already a job that acquired this job, this lock before, and it's still in the queue, we won't be able to acquire the lock, and Laravel is just going to ignore this dispatch because there is an instance of this job already in the queue being processed. And you define that you want your job to be unique. So Laravel is going to ignore all pushes until that instance of the job in the queue is completely processed and the lock is released. Now we had a quick look on how dispatching single jobs work. Let's take a look at how dispatching job chains work under the hood. To dispatch a chain of jobs, you can use the pass facade and call the chain method. The chain method accepts an array of jobs that you want to attach to this chain, and you can set the connection you want to dispatch to the queue and a delay on the first job, as well as you can set a catch callback that will be executed if any of the jobs in the chain fails. So how this works, this is a typical payload of a job that is dispatched to the queue. And you can see this highlighted part. It's a public property on all jobs generated by the PHP artisan make job command. This public property will be used by Laravel to store all the jobs in the chain. So this property here is going to store the rest of the jobs in the chain. In our example, we had 3 jobs in the chain: deploy site, activate deployment, and notify user. What Laravel does is that it's going to take the first job, which is deploy site, and store the rest of the jobs in the chain inside the chain property of the instance of the first job. And that's how the chain jobs is stored in the first job. So here again, we have that's how we dispatch a chain of jobs. And Laravel is going to take the first job in the chain and then store the serialized version of the 2 other jobs inside the chained property of the first job, and then dispatch the first job. So dispatching a chain implements or involves dispatching a single job, but it's a special single job that holds information about other jobs that should be executed after that single job is processed. So in case a worker picks a chain of jobs, it's going to start by executing or processing the first job in the chain. And after it successfully processes the first job, it's going to dispatch the second job in the chain to the beginning of the queue. And of course, the third job or any other jobs that should be in the chain will be dispatched with it as well to be processed later on by the same worker or another worker. And you can notice that the second job in the chain is dispatched to the beginning of the queue, not to the end. So when a worker picks a job, it's going to pick the oldest job first, and then will process jobs until it reaches that job that was just dispatched. So now we know how dispatching single jobs work, how dispatching a chain of jobs work. It's time now to see how dispatching a patch of jobs works. It is how you can dispatch a batch of jobs. We have a bunch of jobs here. We send them using the patch method on the pass facade. You can set the connection, you can set the queue, you can set a catch closure that will be executed if any of the, or whenever the first job in the patch fails, this catch closure will be executed. And then also you can specify a then callback that will be executed whenever the patch or all the jobs in the patch are completely processed. And the way this works behind the scene is that Laravel is going to create an instance of the patch repository, and it's going to call the store method on this instance. And this will create a database record, one that you can see in the screen in front of you. This is the record that Laravel creates or the repository creates. Using the ID of that record, you can find information about the total number of jobs in this batch, the jobs that have been processed, and the jobs that has failed. Also, the IDs of the jobs that failed, so you can investigate or retry them manually if you want. So after the repository creates this record in the database, the queue component is going to send the jobs of this batch to the queue in bulk. Sending jobs in bulk means that we do it in one go. So just one command, or think of it as a single insert statement that inserts several rows in one go. So if we're using the database queue driver and you are sending a batch of jobs to the database queue, Laravel is going to run an insert query with all the jobs that you want to store in the patch. Now the jobs will be living in the queue. So imagine these red jobs are the jobs that we just dispatched from the patch. And unlike the chain, all the jobs will be available to workers to process. So while worker number 1 is executing a job from the patch, worker number 2 can execute a job from the same patch at the same time. And this makes processing a batch of jobs much faster because you can run the jobs in this batch in parallel. Now it's time to do some source diving. I hope I didn't lose you. I hope you have a general idea of how things work. So let's look at some code. So I hope you can see my screen well now. And let's start by looking at the dispatchable trait. This trait is used inside every job that is generated using the PHP artisan make job command when you create a new job in your application. And this is the static method, static helper method that I explained to you in the presentation. When calling this dispatch helper, we're going, or Laravel is going to create an instance of the job that you want to dispatch, which in our case, it's the deploy side job, and pass any constructor arguments from the arguments that you pass to the dispatch method. After that, it's going to create a new instance of the pending dispatch class. Let's take a look at this class. So here, Illuminate Foundation pass pending dispatch, and the constructor receives an instance of our job. And you can do a bunch of things like set the connection and set the queue and so on. But we are mostly interested to look at the destruct method at the bottom of this class. Now, the destruct method is a magic method that PHP is going to execute whenever our dispatching action is going out of scope. So let me explain it in other words. Imagine if you are dispatching a job from inside a controller method. Once the controller method returns a response and it's going out of scope, the method ran and there is nothing else to do. It's PHP is going to destroy or destruct all instances created inside this scope. If we dispatch a job inside the method, and while the scope is destructed, PHP is going to call the destruct method here, this magic method, which will dispatch the job to the queue, actually using the dispatcher component. But before we look at the dispatcher, let's take a look at the should dispatch method here. Now, this method is called before we dispatch any job, and it checks for job uniqueness, as we explained earlier. Here, it checks if this job implements the should be unique interface, which means that this job should be unique. And it sets a different configuration for what cache instance to use for the lock and the ID or the key we use to the lock. And it tries to acquire a lock in the end. If it was able to acquire the lock, it's going to return true, and that means that this job can be dispatched to the queue. If it returns false, that means this job should be ignored because another instance of this unique job is already in the queue, so we cannot dispatch this instance. Now let's go back here to the pending dispatch class, and finally, after doing the check for the uniqueness, we're going to call the dispatcher, which is a component inside Laravel that does the actual dispatching of jobs. So let's take a look at the dispatcher class. PHP Storm here opened the implementation, the contract for us, or the interface. So let's take a look at the implementation. We are interested in looking at the dispatch method here. We are also interested in looking at the dispatch to queue. And this method receives the command. This command is actually the job that you are trying to execute, which is, or you're trying to dispatch, which is the deploy side job in our example. What it's going to do is that is going to create an instance of the queue based on the connection that you are dispatching the job to. In our case, we are dispatching the job to the database connection. So this line is going to create an instance of the database queue, and it's going to use this instance to push the command to the queue. If we look at push command to queue method still inside the dispatcher, it's going to take the instance of the queue, which is the database queue, and the command, which is our job that we want to dispatch. And based on whether or not you are dispatching to a specific queue or setting a delay, it's going to call the correct method. So here, if you are setting a specific queue and the delay, it's going to call later on. If you are setting only a queue, it's going to call push on. If you are only setting a delay, it's going to call later. If you are not setting anything, it's simply going to call the push method on the queue. Now, let's take a quick look at the database queue, or the push method of the database queue. It does two things. First, it creates the payload that's going to be sent to the queue, and it's going to set a callback that does the actual storage in the queue. And because this is the database queue, the storage is simply an insert query that inserts the record in the database. And after it creates the payload and creates the callback, it's going to call an enqueue using method that we are going to look at shortly. But first, let's take a look at the create payload method. Here is the create payload method. It calls the create payload array. And then because our job is an object, we're going to, our Laravel is going to call the create object payload. So inside this method, I think you are by now familiar with this format. It's the payload that we have seen in the presentation. It has a UUID, the display name, and several other attributes. And one of the interesting things that it does here is that it checks if the job should be encrypted. And if so, it's going to create an instance of the encryptor. It's going to resolve it from the Laravel container, and it's going to call the encrypt method on the encryptor and pass the serialized version of our job to it. So if the job should be encrypted, we are going to encrypt it using the encryptor. Otherwise, we're just going to use the serialized version, which is a raw string form. And after that, after we encrypt or just serialize, we're going to pass the command, which is in string form now. We're going to pass it to the command attribute of the data attribute of the payload. Now let's go back to the push method and take a look at the enqueue using method. So before actually enqueuing the job to the queue, Laravel is going to check if this job should be dispatched after database transactions commit. And if so, it's going to resolve an instance of the db.transactions, which is a transaction manager component that Laravel has. And it's going to call the add callback method on it. This method stores all the actions that should be executed after the database transaction commits. In our case here, the action is calling the callback that stores the job to the queue. So this highlighted part here, it represents what the queue is going to do, or what Laravel is going to do to store our job in the database queue. And it's only called inside a callback that's passed to the transaction manager. And transaction manager will only call this callback if there are no database transactions open, or if there are database transactions open, it's going to wait until the database transactions commit and then execute the callback, which pushes the job to the queue. So I hope by now you understand how this part works, because this is actually my recent work in the framework. It's like the most recent contribution I added to the framework, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think it solves a lot of problems. So hopefully you understand now how it works. And of course, if we are not, or the job shouldn't wait until database transactions commit, we are going to call the callback right away and send the job to the queue. That's all it is about dispatching single jobs to the queue. Before we go back to the presentation, let's take a quick look at how dispatching chains and how dispatching batch works. We need to go back to the dispatcher here and check the chain method first on the dispatcher. The bus facade actually resolves to the instance of the dispatcher. So calling bus chain means that we're calling this chain method on the dispatcher. And this chain method, what it does is that it's going to extract or separate the first job. So calling shift on the collection here extracts the first job from the collection. So we create an instance of pending chain. And as the first argument, we pass the first job in the chain. And in the second argument, we pass the rest of the jobs of the chain. Let's take a look at the pending chain class here. So here, job here is the first job in the chain, and the chain is the array of the other jobs that are in the chain. And you can set a connection in the queue, but we are mainly interested in the dispatch method that you call at the end to actually dispatch the chain to the queue. And here it prepares the first job in the chain, makes it ready to be dispatched to the queue. And if you set a queue or a connection, it's going to do that in these lines. And if you set a delay, it's going to set the delay on the first job as well. And finally, at the end, it's going to add the jobs of the chain to the batch. So this chain method here, it just takes the array of jobs of the chain and stores it in the chained property that I showed you earlier. And at the end, our first job here is ready. It's prepared to be dispatched, and it has all the other jobs in the chain stored inside it. Now we can create an instance of the dispatcher and dispatch this first job, and it works the way that we explained earlier. Now let's go back to the dispatcher and check the batch method. Similar to dispatching a chain, it's going to create an instance of pending batch, pass an instance of the container, and the collection of jobs that you want to send to the queue in a batch. Let's take a look at the pending batch, Illuminate Pass pending batch class. Again, you can set the then callbacks and catch callbacks and so on, but we are interested in the dispatch method here. And this method creates an instance of the batch repository called the store method. This creates, or this stores, this line here stores information about the batch inside the database as a database row, as we explained earlier, and it returns an instance of batch. And when we call the add method on the instance of batch, let's take a look at the batch repository. So the database batch repository store method. So it just does an insert inside the database to store the row inside the database that represents the batch, and it returns an instance of bus batch. Here, if we take a look at the batch, we are interested in the add method that is called by Laravel. And inside the add method, we do two things. First, we prepare each job to become part of the batch. We configure the chain inside the batch. So for example, in Laravel, you can dispatch a chain, you can dispatch a batch that contains a chain. So the chain will be dispatched with the batch, and Laravel or the workers are going to pick this chain and execute it as a chain while executing other drops of the same batch as single drops. So this chunk of code here, it does that. It prepares the chain inside a patch, and at the end, it stores the patch ID inside each job in the patch. So while the worker is executing the job, from inside your job code, you will be able to get the patch ID that this job belongs to. And finally, we are going to increment the total jobs. We are here, remember that we are adding, here it's an add method. So we are adding jobs to the patch. So we're going to use the patch repository to update the database record and increment the total number of jobs in this batch. And finally, we are going to resolve an instance of the queue. In our example, we are using the database queue. So this represents the database queue. And we're going to call the bulk method to send all the jobs in this batch to the queue in bulk. And if you have a specific queue specified that you want to dispatch this batch of jobs to, here we are going to pass this queue to the bulk method for Laravel to dispatch the jobs to this queue. So now that we have covered, or we finished the source diving regarding dispatching jobs to the queue, we're going to look now into the queuing jobs and processing them by a worker. But just give me 3 seconds to sip some water and I'll get back to you. All right, so that was a much needed break. Now we're back. So the queuing jobs from the queue. First, let me explain the difference between how the queue works and how a typical request works, because most of you are familiar with how an HTTP request is handled. So a quick recap here: a request comes into your server, and the server starts a process to handle this request. The process starts your application, initializes your application, handles the request by running your code, sends the response, and then terminates the entire process. Another request comes in, and the same scenario happens again. Another process started, a fresh process, a fresh application instance is created, the request is handled, the response is sent, and the process is terminated. The difference between this and how a queue processes drop, or how a worker works, this is the execution plan of a worker. It starts the application, or it starts a process, and this process never exits, it never terminates. Once the process is started, it's going to create an instance of your application and keeps pulling the queue, asking if there are any jobs in the queue to process. If there is a job, it picks it and it processes it, and it pulls the queue back again to find jobs. So it keeps pulling processes for eternity. It doesn't, or it shouldn't, it's not supposed to exit. It will use the same application instance to process all the jobs in the queue. If the queue is empty at any point and the worker pulls a job from the queue and it couldn't find any jobs, it's just going to sleep for a few seconds before trying to get a job again. So if there are no more jobs, it's going to sleep again and then pull until it finds a job to process. And again, this process never exits. So it's a single instance of your application that processes all the jobs, which is a huge performance boost to how queues are handled in Laravel. To start a worker, all you need to do is to call the PHP artisan queue work command. And here is an example of how this command looks like. It's a typical artisan command. You can see the signature here. And inside the handle method, Laravel creates an instance of the worker class that we are going to look at in just a moment. And it's going to call the daemon method on that worker instance and pass the connection, the queue, and any option that you pass to the artisan command. Now that's how the worker class looks like. This is a simplified version, of course, but that's basically how it looks like. First, it's going to start an infinite loop, a while loop, as you can see. This loop never exits, so that's what keeps the process alive and not terminated, because there is an infinite loop. And inside this infinite loop, we continuously pull the queue by calling the getNextJob method. This method pulls the queue and tries to find jobs to process. If it was able to get a job, it's going to run it right away and then look again at the loop or start a new iteration of the loop to get the next job, and so on and so on. If the queue is empty, it's instead of if we couldn't find a job, the worker is going to call the sleep method, which just halts the execution and waits for a few seconds before starting a new loop that checks the queue store again to find the next job to process. Now, a worker command has several options, but we cannot cover all these options or how they work behind the scenes in this presentation alone. So I picked these three options that I think are the most important, and I will show you how to dive in how the worker works to discover how the rest of the options work behind the scene. So here we have the queue option, the timeout option, and the memory option. The queue option, you can say, or you use it to tell the worker to process jobs from these queues. So here we have two queues, the high queue and the low queue. And I'll explain in a bit how Laravel prioritize the queues in a way that the first queue that you specify has more priority than the other queues that you specify. As for the timeout option, you use it to set the maximum execution time for a single job inside the queue. If a job exceeds this time and it didn't finish before this time passes, the instance or the worker is going to get terminated and the process will exit to prevent your worker from being stuck on a job that never finishes. And for the memory option, it sets the maximum memory the worker is allowed to consume. And this is very important because it prevents you from having a worker that eats up all the memory of your server and causes the server to crash. So let's take a look at how this all works. Starting with queue prioritization. So we have seen the getNextJob that the worker calls whenever it tries to pull jobs from the queue. Inside the job, we pass the array, or we pass the string of queues that this worker should be processing jobs from. And this line here, it converts this string to an array, and then we pass it to the for each loop. And inside the loop, we call the pop method on the queue connection. The pop method here, it does the actual querying of the database or the queue driver to find jobs. In our example, if it's the database queue driver, as in our example, the pop method here runs a select query that selects the next job in the table to be processed. If you look at the for each loop here, you will find that it will always check the first queue in the array. And if it finds jobs in that queue, it's going to pop it and return it to the queue to process. On the next iteration, it's also going to check the first queue in the array. It will not check the other queues in the array unless the first queue in the array is empty. Only then the next iteration of the loop will start and will pick a job from the second queue. So I hope this simple explanation of how queue prioritization works gives you an idea of how you can use it in your application. Next, we are going to look at job timeouts, and to implement this, Laravel requires the process control PHP extension. And before starting the infinite loop, the while loop, Laravel is going to enable signal handling using this PHP extension. And after picking a job, it's going to create an alarm using the timeout that you set. In our example, we set the timeout to 60 seconds. So this line here is going to start an alarm that will go off after 60 seconds. And later it sets the signal handling of this alarm. So whenever this alarm is triggered, the closure here, or the function here, the callback here that we pass to the signal handling method, is going to be invoked. And inside this callback, we are just going to kill the entire process. So that explains what I was saying earlier. When the alarm goes off, or when the timeout is hit, we are going to kill the worker process. So the job that is stuck is never eating all the power of your server, and the worker can start again and process other jobs in the queue. So we start the alarm, or we set the alarm, and we set how what should happen after the alarm is triggered. Next, or at the end, after running the job, if the job ran successfully and the alarm didn't trigger, we are going to reset the alarm back to zero, so it never runs. And because this job actually succeeded, we do not need to trigger the alarm that kills the process, because it's already done. Next, we are going to look at how the memory limits work, or how setting the memory limit works. Again, inside the while loop, after running a job, Laravel, or the worker, is going to check the memory usage of this worker using the memory get usage PHP function, and compare it with the memory limit that we set on the worker. And if the memory exceeded the limit, we are just going to kill the process, just like we do when the job exceeds the timeout of the worker. So that's all about the queuing jobs from the queue. Now, let's look at the final thing that we are going to cover in this talk, which is processing jobs. We have seen this getNextJob method before, and we have seen this pop method. And as I explained, what it does is that it picks a job from the queue driver. And if we are using the database queue driver, the pop method is just going to look like a typical query that looks like this. It finds the jobs, or the table that hosts all our jobs, and it selects the job based on the queue that we are consuming, and if the job is available or not, and so on. And once it gets the job, it's going to create an instance of a database job and pass the data that we collected from the database to this database job instance. Now, that's how the database job instance looks like. And there's also an SQS job instance and a Redis job instance. Each driver has his own instance of the job class. So this is the database job. It has a fire method. Workers, when they pick a job, they are going to call the fire method here to execute this job. And inside the fire method, we are going to read the payload of that job, and we are going to extract the class name and the method that should be executed to run the job. Later, we are going to resolve this class that we extracted and then call the method by passing the payload, or the data in the payload, or from the payload of our job. So extracting the class and the method is done from the job attribute part of the payload. And then we call the method of that class and pass the data attribute of the payload. So let me explain it further here. You see this part, this highlighted part, that's the job attribute. The illuminate queue call queue handler is the class that Laravel is going to execute to run your jobs. And the call method here is the method that's going to be executed. So Laravel is simply going to call queued handler, the call queued handler class, and call the call method on this class and pass the data to it to execute the job. So here it is, creates an instance of the call queued handler class, calls the call method, pass an instance of the database job and the data portion of the payload. This is the data portion of the payload. It's what it contains, the serialized version of the job that we want to execute. I think by now you typically understand how this works. It creates an instance of call queued handler and pass the serialized version of your job. Later, inside the call queued handler class, inside the call method, Laravel is going to resolve an instance of your class or of your job. So it's going to convert it from the string form back to the object form, and then set the job instance on this object, and finally calls the dispatch through middleware, which takes your job instance. And if you have any middleware registered on that job, this method here, dispatch through middleware, is going to dispatch this job through this middleware and finally call the handle method on that job. So that's basically how the job processing done. It's going to take the payload, extract the call queued handler class, create an instance of it, call the call method, which resolves an instance of your job class by converting it from the string form to the object form, and then executes this job in the background, or executes it in the worker process. Now it's time for another source dive. This one is going to be quick because I'm about to hit my timeout here, and the talk is going to be terminated. So let's start by checking the work command, the artisan console command. So this is the work command here. You can see the signature. Oh, all right. So PHP Storms decided to hang for a bit here. So this is the signature of the work command. So here, PHP artisan Q work, and these are all the options that you can pass to the command. You can discover this by yourself, and you can see a description of what each option is for. And let's take a look at the handle method here. The handle method does several checks, but at the end, it calls the run worker method. Let's take a look at the run worker method. It uses an instance of the worker, as we explained earlier, and it's going to either call the run next job method on the worker or the daemon method. The run next job method is used whenever you start your worker with an option called once, and this option simply means that you are telling this worker to only process one job and then exit. But that's not what we are explaining here today. So we are interested in the daemon method, which starts a long living process. Now let's take a look at the worker class. Here is the worker class. Let's take a look at the daemon method. Here is the daemon method. This part enables signal handling by the process control PHP extension, as we explained earlier. And then here you can see the while loop starting. It's an infinite loop, as we described earlier. In this part, we call the get next job method that gets the next job in the queue that needs to be processed. And if we get a job, we are going to register the alarm, as we explained earlier. And then we are going to process the job by calling the run job method. If we couldn't find any job, we are going to call the sleep method, as we explained earlier, for the worker to sleep before trying to pick jobs again. And here again, after handling the job, or after running the job, we are going to disable the alarm that we just created. And at the end of the loop, we are going to check if the worker exceeded the memory limits, and if so, we are going to stop this worker. Now, that's basically how the worker works behind the scene. I don't think there's enough time to show you more about how the job is handled and how the call queued handler class is created and so on. But I hope during the presentation, you got the idea and you can explore it on your own. So now back to the presentation. I hope by now you understand how the queue system works. I hope by now it's not as complicated as you thought it is before the talk started. And this is how the queue works. If you are interested to learn more about how to use the queue, back in August, I released a book called Laravel Queues in Action. It has everything I know about Laravel queues. It consists of 4 parts. The first part is a crash course about queues. The second part is a cookbook with real-life problems solved using the queue component. And the third part is a guide to running and managing queues, things like choosing the right machine for running your workers, keeping the workers running, scaling workers, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the book, there is a reference to all the configurations that you can set on a worker or a job or the queue connection, as well as Horizon and everything there is to configure about Laravel queues. If you are interested in this book, you can visit learnlaravelqueues.com to grab your copy. And you can use this coupon code to get a 20% discount on your copy. The coupon code is Laracon 2021 in action. I hope you guys like this talk and I hope you find it useful. I hope you didn't get bored. Thank you for giving me your time. If you have any questions regarding the queues, please reach out to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is themsaid. And thanks again for having me.